Discover the career of your dreams. Learn how to get your foot in the door, stand out, and create the life you desire. This is our time. This is our adventure. Together, you and I will explore the world, discover what's possible, and eradicate wasted potential from existence. I'm Siobhan Colleen. This is Industry Explorers. Let's do another quick round of defining some terms. Boomer.
First thing that I think is okay, boomer, which is boomer. I would say, the first thing that I think of, so boomer is baby boomers. They were right out there. You have 60s to probably like late 50s to about early to mid 70s. And the saddest thing that I find is boomers really are the minority voice. They're the minority generation, but they're the loudest at the microphone. And so even by 2025, the majority of the workforce will actually be millennial. And even right now, the majority of management are actually busters or Generation X. And so boomers still have this almost this dichotomy of being raised in the hippie generation, kind of like, protesting the Vietnam War, but at the same time, falling into line and going back to traditionalism. And so I think that's why it's such a frustration, because they're waiting for millennials to be like them and to quote unquote grow up.
Oh, yeah, that's actually an interesting take on that. I also think that, what's the new generation now? Gen Z?
Yes, yeah, Gen Z.
I think Gen Z, they mistakenly called Gen Xers and millennials boomers because they don't know what boomer actually means. It's a baby boomer because a lot of babies were born after World War II. So,
yeah.
All right, Gen X.
So Gen X would be Gen X or busters. And so they range anywhere from about mid 50s to about like late 40s. The weirdest thing about Gen X is they're very highly cynical. They're also called latchkey kids. They were raised on MTV. And so they were like, if you have Saved by the Bell and you brought them to adulthood, that would be Gen Xers. And so there's this feeling of they're sort of in the middle, but it was in between the idea of the family, the parents going out to work at the same time, and they were sort of left to their own devices. So when you're looking at Generation X, for instance, they work much better in isolation. They look at millennials and think that we're nuts when we want to work in teams. And so there's an idea of cynicism and judgment from them because they're very much a pull themselves from the bootstraps type of generation.
Gen Xers also kind of tend to be the ones who say like, oh, back in my day, the world was safer because you could play outside and not worry about getting kidnapped, or you could ride in the back of a truck, or you could ride in the car with no seatbelt on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I sense a lot of frustration from that generation because that's their childhood. That's what they grew up with. But as you pointed out in one of your articles, that's not how millennials and Gen Z grew up, especially Gen Z, because those kids grew up where school shootings are the norm.
Yeah, Gen Z was very protected because the idea of they could never be safe. And even the idea of branding. They don't trust brands anymore. So a lot of businesses have really gone out of business because it's no longer about just having the graphics, having something that's tantalizing to the senses. It's about authenticity. And so Generation Z is extremely non-trusting.
That's fascinating. Millennial.
Oh, millennials are fun. Millennials are anywhere from about 40. So like about like mid to early 40s. And some people say they're 25. I differ with that perspective because I see a definite difference between a 25-year-old and a 30-year-old millennial. It's vastly different. So I personally believe that it would be anywhere from about 40, like early 40s to about 28. But they're very team oriented. And so when the idea of getting a trophy for participation, that was a very millennial thing to do. Hover parents, where it's like the parents were always involved. There was always an idea of getting the child into college, the parents would sit right next to them in the interview, which has had its good points and bad points. The good thing about millennials, also because we're becoming much more racially diversified country, is the idea of intergenerational households. And so millennials are huge when it comes to actually caring for their boomer parents but also taking care of their Generation Alpha or even Gen Z children. And so we're seeing a huge idea of family first and paycheck later. They would much rather have a flexible job, a place to have family. They want to live in a world that gives them a sense of healthy balance, not so much work the ladder and get to the top. And millennials, we're very much used to lateral leadership. And so when we step into a situation, if we know the job better than someone who's been there for 40 years, we want to be picked. And we don't see the idea of someone's year or someone's age giving them the experience or giving them that up that we actually have if we can do a better job. And so when we step into the workforce, we expect equality because that's what we've experienced growing up.
Yeah, I totally agree. Gen Z, the TikTok generation.
Yeah. Gen Z is really interesting. That's why I definitely differ with the idea that millennials are 25. For instance, I have a bunch of Gen Z friends and I was trying on this sweater in New York City. Well, I come out and my friend says, "Oh, you didn't ask me before you purchased it?" I'm like, "No." Gen Z takes teamwork to the extent and they rarely do anything without permission from their peers. It's a very codependent generation, which has its pros and its cons. The good thing about Gen Z is when you look at, what happened with the shooting, what happened with the March for Our Lives. It's almost like the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. If one person stands up, then all of them will back it up. And so Gen Z has the power to truly create movements that millennials never did. We were able to speak out our ideas and kind of speak out our frustration. But Gen Z is sort of, their behavior matches their ideology. And so that's why their movements are so much bigger than I'd say that millennials. But in the same way, when you look at even what's happening with COVID, if one person doesn't want to obey the rules, then many people don't want to obey the rules. And so there's a fear of being different. And I think there's a fear of sort of breaking from the norm and breaking from the community. Even with the idea of sexuality, there was a recent study that said 46% of all Gen Zs identify themselves as bi. And so, which was vastly much more in number. But I think that's the truth for them because they feel that their community is much more accepting and will be much more supportive than previous generations. And so there's that freedom for them to actually be truthful with who they are.
Oh, I think you've given me a generational existential crisis because I am 25, going to be 26 pretty soon. And now I don't know who I am. Am I a millennial? Am I a Gen Z? I kind of pull from both.
Yeah. What do you feel like you most identify with?
I honestly feel like I most identify with millennials because most of my friends are millennials. And I will say, though, in my relationship, I do see a difference between my partner and I. He's 10 years my senior. And so sometimes we really relate to something because we both grew up with it. Or sometimes he'll mention something and I'm like, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about. That I did not grow up with that.
Yes, yeah.
And part of it too is him growing up in Missouri, me growing up in California. Geographical differences right there too. So
yes, I am always jealous where it's like I need a TikTok for dummies and a Snapchat for dummies because I do feel like an okay boomer at that point because technology is. I didn't get my first smartphone until I was 23. And I do envy Gen Z for having a little bit more of that assimilation than I did.
I remember getting my first phone, like my first cell phone, like 8th grade or something.
Wow.
And to me, that seemed late because my other friends were getting cell phones in elementary school. It's funny.
Yeah.
Okay, so I love how in-depth we're going with all of these definitions.
Yeah, me too.
And I want to keep going. I want to talk about what is LGBTQIA plus and what is the difference between sexuality and gender?
Okay, so L, lesbian, G, gay, B, bisexual, LGBT, Q, queer. I need like an ABC chart. LGBTQ. I, intersexual. A is asexual. And then plus is anything within the gamut. So you have those that are pansexual, those who identify as, there was a person that I interviewed just recently and they identified as trans queer. And so I think having that plus at the end has really been beneficial because it allows people to feel like they're part of a community without fitting one of the four distinctives.
There's a documentary on National Geographic that Kitty Kirk did about gender, and she interviews different people, and both young and old. So, it was a very fascinating documentary. I don't quite remember what it was called, but have you seen it?
I haven't. No, I'd love to.
It seems like it would be right up your alley. But so intersexual. Is that the same thing as gender fluid?
I believe intersexual is someone who's actually born with both genitalia.
Oh, okay.
And so, yes, but gender fluid would fall under gender identity. So you'd have gender fluid, gender non-binary, but you also have what's called trans experience, transgender, trans male, trans female. And so I think understanding, to me, one thing that I've found that's been super helpful, and I think, especially within the cisgender community, is understanding how we identify ourselves is so huge, because every single person, I feel like, under their name tag should have their pronouns. It just gives you such a beautiful understanding of how people identify themselves and how you can pay respect to them, but even just understanding how they use their pronoun. And so that's been huge for me. And I would say you cannot have conversation without actually creating that conversation with pronouns.
I feel like now I totally should have started this podcast conversation with, hi, I'm Siobhan. I'm she, her, hers.
Yep.
And Dr. Colleen Batchelder, what are your pronouns?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. She, her, hers.
Never it though, right?
No.
That's dehumanizing.
Yes. Yeah. And I think a lot of people just don't know, especially when you're talking about someone who's gender non-binary. And the saddest thing is when you look at the LGBTQ community, there's a lot of wonderful videos that are educational for people that talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual. There are barely any videos that actually explain the trans experience and for those that are gender non-binary. And so I think having more media focus on that, having more media of interviewing people so that every single person can understand the experience of individuals.
I honestly love TikTok for that reason, because any user can just put up their 60-second video, and I feel that I learn a lot from different people. And it goes back to ethnography, where you're just soaking it in. You're just taking it in. You're just observing. You're understanding. And you're not really forming an opinion or an offense to it. You're just observing. You're just saying, okay, that exists. That's what that community is. Okay, these are the interactions, these are the perspectives, the behaviors, the likes and dislikes, preferences. And I love TikTok for that reason, because I get to see. I don't even know. I can't even put it into words, because honestly, as a cis white woman, I don't have the best understanding, of that community or what it's like to be in that community at all. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I definitely think I love the fact that social media is giving people a voice piece. And before, even with Facebook, like Facebook was the first thing that started when I was just starting college, and it was great, but it didn't give people the amount of ability to share their story. It still was about making connections. It still was about, kind of putting your best face forward. Where I think when you look at Snapchat or TikTok, especially, it's giving people the ability to just be 100% who they are. And I love that. And I think right now, especially, we're without excuse, where it's like, if we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we relate to people? How do we understand their story? As you were saying, where it's like just listening to someone and seeing them on TikTok and just kind of keeping an open mind about, okay, this is how this person identifies. This is their likes. This is their dislikes. How do I connect and converse? TikTok really has created this ethnographic experience where we don't even need to step out. We just need to allow ourselves to say, okay, what can I learn from this?
Yeah, exactly. I feel that I have a call to action after this conversation, because, I got to do more than just watch the TikToks. I need to actually go and watch those YouTubes and go talk to more people who have perspectives other than my own. With that said, what are some of the benefits for someone who is not part of a certain community, whether it's the Black community, the LGBTQIA plus, or the Asian community, or any other community that you're not a part of? What are the benefits of understanding the experiences of other people?
Oh, definitely. I think, one of the most beautiful things is I think, when you look at our history books, when you look at what we've been taught, a lot of it has been filtered by a very white cis perspective. And so there's a type of ownership that I think we need to take on that. But there's history that we have not been exposed to, and inventors and people and great leaders that we have the opportunity to learn from. And I think especially too, where it's almost like, if, those who are cisgender and those who are white, we can highly benefit from learning from someone who's Asian or BIPOC or people within the LGBTQIA, because it widens our world and it allows us to understand that our perspective is not the only one. And it gives us the idea of forming community, not forming bubbles, but actually forming community where we're able to actually gain understanding and sharpen ourselves and become better of who we are. And I think if we're able to take that teachable stance, we're able to appreciate those differences. And I think also too, we're able to empathize and also stand up and create spaces where people are not persecuted based upon race, where we're standing up against police brutality. And so because of that awareness, it not only widens our ideology of what should happen, it compels us behaviorally to truly stand up so that we're changing the narrative.
Absolutely. When we have an understanding and a respect towards other people, we get to have more people join our party.
Yeah.
I just like to think of life as this big party and everyone's invited. And if you're vegan, don't worry. You can still come. We got vegan options over here. All right. Doesn't matter. That's such a lame metaphor, but that's just how my mind works.
I'm dairy free, so I love that metaphor.
Yeah. So let's talk about, gosh, I know I called this a quick fire round, but you just go so in depth and I love it because I'm learning so much. Let's talk about marginalization and social exclusion.
Ooh, good stuff. So marginalization is when you are part of a minority group, but also you're marginalized. And so, for instance, as a woman or someone who identifies as female, it's the idea of being less than. It's the idea of almost like when you think of the Olympics, it's never being able to get to that gold medal stand. It's always that idea of being separate. And so I would say that marginalization, it always casts one group of people as the norm and the other grouping of people as the other.
An example of that I'm thinking of, and correct me if I'm wrong, would that be like a conservative woman feeling marginalized because she doesn't have liberal beliefs? And so she's casted by that sort of, community?
Yeah, no, I think definitely. I think also too, even like with the idea of beliefs, I think about the story of a woman who was wearing the hijab and who was going into the room as working as a medical personnel. And she was discriminated against. She was marginalized because of her faith. And so if the hospital was to look at that and discriminate against religion, then she would be cast as marginalized. And so, but taking into the idea of what are her religious beliefs? Why is this so important for her to feel included? And what can we do as a community and as a hospital to make sure that, yes, we create a clean and safe environment, but also we respect the fact that she needs a head covering and that's personal to her. And so I think getting back to your question of the idea of conservatism, it's the idea of every single one of us is on a journey. And so if we're to connect with each other and to converse, I think we don't have the idea of marginalization or sort of putting people in boxes, because we're creating open conversations and safe spaces where we can learn from each other, but also realizing that every single one of us are in different stages and we're never going to stop growing.
I bring up the conservative example because that's like my background. It's like my parents are conservative and like how a lot of people's parents are conservative. So I am used to hearing conversations and more, and frustrations towards certain ideas or the other. But I mean, like, I love my parents dearly, but they definitely express their frustration of feeling like if they don't think the way like the quote unquote liberal media wants them to think, then they're less than, they're not part of the community. And, part of, inclusion is, I guess that's my way of trying to be inclusive with our conversation, because I think it could be really easy for someone to be like, oh, they're just, they just have liberal ideologies and they're trying to push that on us. And it's like, no, I'm not trying to push it. You want to be, if you want to be conservative, that's your deal, right? That's totally cool. Just don't try and force me to do it,
Exactly. And I think it's almost an idea of a personal ownership. And I think asking yourself, is my belief hurting those around me? Gives you that idea of, okay, can I have this belief? And if it is hurtful, if it is harmful, questioning it. And questioning it, is my belief for comfort? Am I just afraid to grow? Or, I have a lot of conservative colleagues, especially being in the ministry world. And so I've got colleagues who are very much on the spectrum of more liberal than I am, more conservative, and I sort of like fall, like some more toward the liberal end. But it's this idea of when we're together and we're able to sort of respect each other and find commonality, and we're in that space of not trying to convert each other, I think it's really helpful. And I think for me personally, I'm always humbled when I talk to people of all different backgrounds, because I was not affirming, I would say, when I was 14 years old. But I became affirming because of the research and the experiences that I had in the conversations with people. And so I always try to respect the person's stage and where the person is, because just because we're part of humanity does not mean that we're on that same stage wherever we are. Every single person is on a different journey. And so I think when we try to understand why is it that you believe what you believe, and you delve deeper into that, is it based upon personal conviction? Is it based upon fear? Are you afraid of changing? Are you afraid of being excommunicated? I mean, when I came out as affirming, I was excommunicated from a lot of churches. And so there was a cost involved. And so I think trying to understand conservatives from that idea of, are you afraid that you will be kicked out by your family? Are you afraid if you step out and you become more vocal? What is your main reason behind this belief? If it's true conviction, then that's, we have that freedom. But if it's based upon fear, if it's based upon worry, I think trying to create a community where people know that they're safe, that they'll know that they're supported alongside that journey, will help them kind of experiment and research past their own upbringing.
Let's talk about privilege versus legal right.
Good idea. Can you go a little bit more into that? Because I want to make sure that I answer the question well.
So privilege and legal right. We're hearing a lot of conversation about white privilege or about woman privilege, attractive woman privilege. And we hear these different conversations, and we hear about how healthcare might be a privilege, or is it a human right? Should we have the right to healthcare? And so, those two things are very different. And I was just wondering, what are some of the thoughts that are on the forefront of your mind right now regarding those topics?
Yeah, no, great question. And so getting into the idea of white privilege, I will never forget the time that I was seated in a restaurant, and it was in South Jersey. And so South Jersey is a very interesting, dichotomy. There's a lot of, racial undertones. And I was sitting across from a friend who was a Black woman, and we were told that we were bullied by the woman, by the server, and told to move. And she's like, you need to get out of here. You need to move, because we were by the window. And they didn't want it to look like they were just serving Black people. I was appalled. But the problem is that I exercised my white privilege and became a white witness. And I spoke for my Black friend. And so I realized that there's such a sense of understanding your white privilege, but also not exercising it all the time, and realizing that taking ownership of it. Because by speaking up in that moment, it dehumanized my person of color friend across from me, because it was saying that in order for the white woman who was the server to believe me, that I as a white woman had to speak up for the table. And so there is always an element of white privilege, because it's this idea of that whites hold more clout, that whites hold more respect. And I think understanding that in the sense of sort of letting it go and allowing people, as I said, setting that platform, not speaking for people, because it becomes a sense of white witness, whitewashing, tokenism, and, just representation without listening to the dialogue. And the biggest thing that I would also think about white privilege is this idea of, and I've heard from a lot of my friends who are trying to create this racial justice conversation. And they turned to me and they said, Colleen, how can we create, talk about Black Lives Matter and talk about this, but we don't want to offend the white people. And I'm like, if you're worried about offending the white people, you're never going to get anywhere with racial justice, because you're still creating a system of white supremacy where you're protecting the white person and you're allowing them not to change their behavior, their mindset, their thoughts, because the idea is more to preserve the white than it is to actually create better spaces for people of color. And so I would say that that's two instances that I've definitely seen that are very problematic with white privilege and how people go about creating conversation on racial justice. And I think getting back to your idea of human rights, I think healthcare honestly should be a human right. You look at even the idea of voting. People were able to vote because they were able to vote by mail. And so the idea, when you look at communities of color and the fact that there's no voting area in there, it's discriminatory. They don't have that same right as other people. And so the idea of sort of creating rights for all people and more of that equality, I think enables more people to have a voice and to really, truly shape this country. It's almost like, yes, we need to create, people of color and people of all different, gender identities and sexual orientations and invite them to the boardroom. But we also need to allow them to shape America. Because even in the year, I believe it's like 2045, minorities will actually become majorities. And so how are we creating in America? How are we creating a system that works for all people, not just preserving whiteness?
That's just a lot to have sink in to my mind right now. And I never really heard it put that way, where if you are concerned about preserving a white person's emotions or feelings, then you are still enforcing white supremacy because you are making your voice lesser than that of the white person. That's an interesting statement. I just never really thought of it that way. So, taking all of your education and experiences and your incredible research, what career did that actually lead to for you?
Yeah, it led me away from the church, because I realized that, you can have systems and you can have organizations that want to change their ideology, but they have no desire to implement change. And so for me, I honestly just gave up, because I'm like, I was tired of sort of dealing with the rhetoric and dealing with people who looked like they wanted to change on the outside, but really had no desire to move forward. And it's just behind in so many different ways. And so for me, it pushed me on to sort of stepping into business. And so having a doctorate and having like a seminary background, I never imagined really being in a business arena. And so I write for Entrepreneur, I write for Lifehack. I'm a featured contributor for She Owns It, and I'm consulting and executive coaching. And so working with businesses and working with organizations that not only want to change, but truly are willing to is really exciting for me, because I'm able to kind of work with a captive audience that wants to walk along the journey. And so that's where it's led me. It's led me to wear multiple different hats and be busier than ever. But it's just such a better environment. And for me, it has been emotionally healthy and just life-giving, more so than any of my jobs combined. I've just really enjoyed it.
So what does that consulting work look like? Do you have like a bunch of meetings throughout? Like, do you meet for a day? Do you meet for the course, over the course of several weeks? What does that look like?
Yeah, no, so for instance, when I worked with Thrive Financial, so I had set up a talk, and so like a short workshop on the idea of intergenerational. And so what it looks like to actually be a caregiver and as a millennial and interact with different generations and understand where people are coming from so that people could actually live and survive this pandemic without going crazy by each other's differences. And so that was a one-time offering. Another way that I actually work with companies is sort of helping them understand. I recently got a pitch from a company, and they wanted me to help them with diversity and also brand awareness. Well, their desire was to showcase diversity. When I looked more into the company, I realized that a lot of the complaints and a lot of the frustrations was that there is no diversity to really push forward. And so when I would work with a company like that, it would be much more about interviewing the different employees, understanding where they are, and then helping the leadership work with the reality, not what their assumptions are, but helping them to journey. They might be thinking that they're on the fourth step of diversity, but they really might be starting at step one.
Mm-hmm. So do companies usually seek you out, or do you have to convince people that diversity and inclusion are important?
Kind of a mix of both. And so I would say as being a contributor to Entrepreneur and other business magazines has been great because it enables me to not have to cold call as much. They already see my work out there and they realize what I do. But I still have had to research and do cold calls and just pitch them and help them understand that this is something that is beneficial for your organization. So my last article, it was funny, got picked up by a lot of financial individuals. And so a lot of it was, they're looking for diversity, where it's like the analytical companies that are very much on the bottom line, understanding how do you create an emotionally safe space environment so that your employees flourish. And so helping them understand that your team will actually benefit your productivity, but it has to start internally for you to make action steps outward.
You know how people say you have to love yourself before you can love others? You have to take care of yourself, or you have to look inward before your cup overflows, and then you can help others and make the world a better place. It sounds like it's very similar when it comes to a company.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. A lot of stuff starts internally. For instance, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was mentioning that this organization that he was a part of said, oh, they've been hiring more people of color. And I asked him, I said, are they hiring people of color for representation, or are they actually enabled to create a voice and shape the organization? And he realized that it was very much a tokenism response. And so when companies try to create this change and try to create, diversity and inclusion, a lot of the times they do it for the sake of board member, they do it for the sake of duty, or even, President Biden's initiative. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, it's about a checkoff list. But if they're willing to actually take that time to be introspective, they won't just create a better year, they'll create a better company and actually increase their bottom line over time.
So it sounds like when companies actually engage in that tokenism, that's where a lot of the criticism comes from, when people say, oh, she was only hired because she's a woman, or that person was only hired because they're Black or because they're Asian or whatever.
Yeah. No, and I think it's, as you were saying, it's that idea of bringing someone on, but not giving them the power to be a voice in the company. And so when people see, people of different ethnicities or a woman coming into a very male-dominated job, in my every single job that I've had, I would say that I've been maybe 1 out of 2 women. And so I'm very used to that perspective. And I've had a lot of males question why I'm there, and the idea that you have to prove 3 times as much as if you were a man in that position. And so I think it definitely starts at the leadership level. And that starts with policy, to make sure that people know that it's not a company of tokenism, it's not a company of just representation, but how do we actually create this sphere of inclusion so that the company is changed, not just one person here and one person there, and they're sort of scattered about to make the company picture look better.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So what is the most rewarding aspect of your career?
I love seeing people be able to be honest with me. And I think that's a blast, where it's like when I'm on an executive coaching call and they're able to feel comfortable just saying, look, this is where I'm at. This is my frustration. This is even my bias. This is my upbringing. And they feel like they're in a safe space, but they're willing to move forward. I love that. I would rather someone come to me who really comes with a lot of baggage, but is willing to own that baggage, than someone across from me saying that I'm fine, I'm good, I just want to move forward. Because if people are willing to be honest, then you can actually help them get there to where they want to be. And so I love seeing people succeed even further than what their goals are. I really enjoy just being a part of that movement for them.
If a high schooler were watching this, or if a high schooler were listening to this and they wanted to get into what you do, they wanted to do diversity and inclusion consulting work, what kind of degrees or certifications would you recommend?
That's a great question. You know what? The world is changing, and I would say the world is changing in better ways. My hope is that because it's much more open to trade experience and there isn't that push for the college degree as I had when I was a millennial kind of starting out, is that you won't need to have, 10 plus years of college to actually get here. I would say the first thing to do is talk to people in that industry, really bounce off ideas. And because as you talk to people in that industry, you'll understand your passion, because you might be thinking that you want to go into diversity and inclusion work, but you might have such a love for leadership or executive coaching or find your place and figure out what it is that makes you tick. When I was first starting out, I connected with two great entrepreneurs, Kamanzi and Cindy Constable. And as I got a chance to talk to them, I said, look, I'm extroverted. I'm this. I said, I love crowds of people. And he turned to me and he said, Colleen, you would suck as a coach. You'd be great, but it would suck the life out of you. And he's like, don't just concentrate on what you can do, but concentrate on what actually fills you. And he said, knowing your personality and just kind of connecting with you, he said, if you're a group person and you like the adventure and you like the travel, he said, put more energy in consulting than you do with one-on-one coaching. You can do that, but figure out where you want to spend the bulk of your time. And so understanding your personality, understanding who you are as a person, and really getting the feedback from people who are in the business. Because a lot of the times I was sort of a hamster spinning on that same wheel over and over again. And I was moving, but I wasn't making progress.
What are some of your favorite books?
I have them with me.
Yes, they're literally in your hand.
Yes!
That's so great.
So it's called Inclusion, Diversity, and the New Workplace and the Will to Change. And so you've got that book right here by Jennifer Brown. It was, as you can see, I absolutely adored it. And then the next one, this is a series of books. It's called How to Work and Lead People Not Like You. And it's a really short book. I'd say it's maybe about 100 pages or so, but it just gets you into that fact of understanding your experiences, your background, understanding how you approach the world. And when you understand your own lens, then you're able to appreciate that of others. The next one is, this is more anthropology and ethnography, Leading with Cultural Intelligence, The Real Secret to Success by David Livermore. And it's very like academic and heady and dorky. But that's a really great place to start. The next one is called, this one I absolutely adore because I feel like it, especially if you're just starting out, and I would even recommend this for parents and those that are even coming from more of a conservative background, and you're just looking to really understand the experience of someone who's LGBTQ. I'd recommend True Inclusion by Brandon Robertson. And again, it's maybe 70 pages, but this is incredible. He has worked with multiple government organizations. He's been a pastor at different churches. But just his experience of sort of being going to a conservative seminary and then coming out at a later age and sort of experience and expressing his experience as a Christian and what that meant for him. And sort of marrying his faith and his being LGBTQ was really a good eye opener. And then the last one is Inclusive Leadership, the Definite Guide to Developing and Executing an Impactful Diversity and Inclusion Strategy. And so this is a great book if you're looking to take your ideology and put it into implementation.
Do you think you're going to write a book one day?
I do.
Yes.
Yes, it is. So I know we talked a little bit about emotional balance. And one of the things that I've done this year that's really changed the game plan is create quarter goals. And so for this quarter, and push me on this, just text me all the time to make sure that I get this done. My goal is to actually send out a book proposal with my book on diversity and inclusion by the end of this month. But I've desired to do it. And to me, I've started to take my dreams and my ideas and turn them into practical goals. And so, but that's my goal, is to actually just get out there and get that book written.
I love that. And I love that when there's more of this kind of material to consume, then it just becomes more of the norm. And then we learn as a society how to be more inclusive.
Yes, definitely.
Oh, I'm going to text you about it for sure. You'll get a text from me at the end of March. Hey,
good.
Where is this? How is it going?
Yep.
Oh, that's exciting. I'm very excited for you. Where can people follow you on social media?
Yeah, so you can follow me on LinkedIn. So I am under Dr. Colleen Batchelder. And just think of a bunch of older people, batch of elders. And that's exactly how you spell my name. And then also ColleenBatchelder.org. And so if you just contact me through those two places, and then that also links to my other social media pages on Twitter, Instagram, and elsewhere.
Awesome. Would you like to give our listeners a call to action?
I would love to. So the first thing that I would say is, if you're just starting in this system, don't start from assumption. Create time to explore your own bias, but also connect with people and just sit there and learn. Don't converse. Don't think about what you're going to say. Don't always be ready with a reaction, but just absorb. Have that time of ethnography, of listening, seeing, smelling, and understanding a different perspective, so that, and it's not to help your career, but it's to make you a better person. And I think once you actually develop that love for diversity, then that helps you really steer your career forward and figure out what you really are created to do.
I'm just soaking it in. I feel like I have the lamest reactions and responses to everything on this episode because I'm literally just a sponge this whole time.
You were great. I was nervous about this interview, and it was like sitting across the Starbucks and having a cup of coffee.
I'm really glad. That means a lot to me. Yeah, no, this is definitely an episode that I'm going to personally listen to over and over again. And I wrote down all the books that you had in your hand and were just flashing across the screen. Like, that was amazing. And in case people don't see the video version of this, her background, Dr. Colleen's background, is these amazing bookcases. It's just nothing but books behind her. There's 100 books behind. There's more than 100 books behind her, I'm pretty sure. And she was so ready with her top, what was it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that she recommended us. So that was amazing. Thank you for those recommendations. And thank you for chatting with me today. I learned a lot, and I'm going to continue to learn a lot and continue following you on social media because you have great articles. I love reading them. Yeah, with that said, do you have any last minute words of wisdom or any last minute thoughts you want to share with everybody?
I think this was great. I encourage everybody to share the word about Siobhan's podcast, because this is great. And to me, it's almost like it's the conversation that we need to be having. And it showcases people from all different backgrounds. So Siobhan, thank you so much for what you do. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And until next time, listeners, I'll see you on our next adventure. Take care. Take what you learned from today's expert and play. You heard me? Go play. Just try something new, because that's the best way to discover your passion and purpose. If you found the episode insightful, give Industry Explorers a 5-star rating and tell us what you learned in your review. Subscribe to Industry Explorers on YouTube for more adventures. Industry Explorers is made possible by the support and contributions from explorers like you. Thanks for listening. I'll see you on our next adventure.